Welcome back to Leadership Talks by Advertising Vietnam and Precious Communications. I'm your host, Lars Födisch, and in today's episode, we will talk about how to connect with customers from podcast to AI, from social media to news checking. And our guest today is the co-founder and CEO of Vietcetera. Welcome, Hao.
Thank you, Lars. And hello, everybody. Thank you for having me on the podcast, Advertising Vietnam, and also Precious Communications. Really excited to kind of dive into this.
Fantastic. So let's dive right into it. As a media platform, you most likely are at the forefront of shifts in consumer behavior. And you brought podcast to the market like not many other media. You see what news checking can do. What are the latest trends that you see that is changing consumer behavior and media consumption?
So one important thing for all those of you listening to is the idea that Vietnamese is the only language spoken here, official language. And you can say this other way around. Vietnam is the only place that speaks Vietnamese. So the whole content media landscape here is very unique in itself. So I guess I'll answer your question in two parts. One is unique to Vietnam for all of those you listening that want to hear from a Vietnamese perspective, and also from a global one. And that's because we have English language, but we also are a player in the whole landscape, as you are on a regional level, at least. So I'll just start locally. I think, a lot of trends have happened in the past 2 years, and I think everyone knows what those are, including short-form video. You have content creators exploding on the scene, and people are talking about the fall of legacy media, and all of those definitely apply here. But of course, the barrier of entry here is much higher than basically anywhere else in the world, almost with the exception of maybe China and potentially other places. But in the sense that there are regulations around media and content, and also the market's very sensitive to the fact that these big tech guys are not actually here physically in Vietnam yet. Google is moving next month, though, physically their office to Vietnam. So I do expect some shifts in terms of talent, in terms of how media spends are implemented in the very near future because of that distinction, regulation, like getting a license to operate in the country. Just following the rules, right? I think that's very important as well. And then I'll speak perhaps more about the media kind of consumption habits. People say that especially youngsters have stopped reading. Now, I can say as a matter of fact from our own website that has been somewhat of the case. Search traffic is still very powerful. However, direct kind of media consumption is definitely more angled towards our podcasts, for instance. The regularity with that, the brand love is very high. And people want specific content. They don't want to be too broad. They want to know what they're tuning in, especially in the age of when there's just so much content these days. If you're talking about everything, you're almost talking about nothing. So you got to keep it a bit more focused, either in terms of topic or mindset. And I think on the global level, that's also what's happening. At the global level, I guess the one big thing is what I see is how, despite any language, content can really be global. Vietnam hasn't quite reached that yet, but you look at things like Korean culture and media, either it be music, entertainment, or movies, and you can say the same thing about English content. It's just a truly global reaching content game, so it's no longer just in country.
With that uniqueness of the media market in Vietnam that you just described, how hard is it for global brands to get it right to connect to audiences here in terms of cultural references, format, media platforms?
Vietnam is one of the most attractive destinations for anything media advertising. I'll be very honest about that, just from the sheer numbers. Like, just so many young people. It must be a top 10 country for the growth of young people. I also read a statistic recently that in this calendar year, Vietnam is a top 5 contributor in absolute value of the number of people entering the middle class. It's 4 million people. 4 million Vietnamese are entering the middle class today, this calendar year. It's only beat by China India, and like Brazil and Indonesia, which obviously makes sense given the population sizes. But think about that, a top 5 contributor into the middle class. That opens the doors into so many different content possibilities for not just consumers. They demand higher value of quality of life. They want to know more information, but also brands. I brought up this number to a colleague of mine, or one of our clients at Unilever, Lifebuoy, actually. They sell soap. Is it Unilever? I hope so. And he was talking about how, because of this kind of market research, they know that Vietnamese are getting wealthier. And what is the one thing that they start buying in that category? Liquid soap. So instead of bar soap, they start, upgrading to liquid soap, just because of that shift in the middle class. So I think that's incredibly exciting from a content and brand and audience perspective. So that's one particular theme that I found quite intriguing.
This year, how have you seen this shift of brand money moving? Because there's a lot of caution globally across from consumer brands to car brands. Have you seen the same trend here in Vietnam, especially for Vietcetera in general, or are there certain categories that are still doing well and even turning up the spend, or is it just changing and moving around? Same time, and I know the question gets a little bit big, everybody's talking about omni-channel, so I have maybe same budget, but I need to divide it by 20 now for channels instead of 5 before.
So I guess we're a bit unique in our perspective in that if you just look at our top line revenue, for instance, we're actually growing. Perhaps not as high as we'd like, but just because we're kind of starting from a lower base, we are still growing. So that's encouraging from an internal perspective. I would say, though, that from what I've been hearing, people have been having a bit of a downturn. And this is all actually even in the public. So one of the biggest media companies in Vietnam, they're a publicly traded company, year over year, year ending 2023, they were down something like 25%, I believe, perhaps even more. You can reference the public records of this particular company. I'm not going to say it, but you can find it. It's the biggest online newspaper in Vietnam. And despite that, they're still profitable. In our case, our core business revenue did also see a bit of weakness, but where we made up ground was we started talking to our advertisers, our audience, and you say customers, that was your initial question. Customers is two ways, audience and the brands. And when we were talking to them, again, the demand for higher quality content, but also more expert content. So no longer, in our case, we are seen as tastemakers, but we're not experts. So just off camera, I was using the example where someone like you who does not live here, you might ask me a question like, hey, Hal, what's the coolest coffee shop these days? And you might ask someone from Vietcetera that because we're on the pulse, we know what's going on. But you're only asking that because we're tastemakers, not experts. And so I think the demand for higher quality content, more in-depth about verticals and niche, uncovering really expert opinions about all these different topics, the demand is there today. So that's what we're serving with our initiatives at Vietcetera.
Does it also mean then, from a brand's perspective, gone are the days of mass media and I'm willing to spend more for a smaller but higher quality target audience?
I believe so. I think Vietcetera actually has proven that since day one. And I'll give one data point. In the media industry and advertising, especially performance, we use one metric called average revenue per user. And on our measurements, our content, despite being much less audience, when I say much less, I mean compared to some of the really big guys, we're like not even 10% of their audience. Our ARPU was 37 cents back in 2022. We haven't done this analysis recently, but it's 37 cents per active user on Vietcetera's channels. If you take that same formula and apply it towards the really mass media companies in Vietnam, it's like 5 to 6 cents. And you could even compare that to Google AdSense. That's actually a very good benchmark, or Facebook ads. Like when I first came to Vietnam in 2016, buying impressions on Facebook or views on YouTube was actually quite cheap. I don't remember the exact number, but that has continued to increase over every year, every month it goes up. And actually even our YouTube ad revenue on our own channel, it not only goes up because the view count's going up, but it's not proportionate anymore. It's taking leaps and bounds. Like actually our highest month ever in YouTube AdSense was last month, the month of June.
What drove it?
Our view count did go up, but it wasn't like doubling or something like that. It was very organic growth, but the CPMs were higher. So, I mean, that tells me that Google's system is detecting higher auction for the keywords. We're mostly a general interest lifestyle company on our videos, content. So that tells you there's either more competition for those keywords, or people are just putting bigger budgets behind these things and spending more. So,
do you also have interactions with brands that say, okay, we love what you guys are doing, but we actually want to do the same, but I want to put my brand stamp on it and own it?
All the time. Et cetera, we don't do as much white labeled content. So a lot of the time, brands will come to us because they like our style and our content and want us to create content for them. We do that, but in a very limited basis. We generally only do it if, one, it meets our budget, as with any kind of business, or second, we know the client really well. We've done a lot of content with them in the past. The brand story is there. It's very clear about the communication style. So if one of those criteria are met, we'll do that kind of content. Now, on branded content on Việc, et cetera, stamping brands everywhere, it's a delicate balance. I think it's the only way that content can thrive, though, Vietnam, or anywhere really, and be sustainable. So I think it's just a balance of how to integrate it, how to communicate it, where audience really want to engage with that brand. And I will say, being a content consumer myself, there are a lot of brand channels, content creators, media companies that do it really well, and you want to watch their ads. And I think, how do we achieve that? Because I think today's generation of marketers, sometimes it's confused with advertisers. Mm-hmm. Like, I think the generation of, actually the better term is marketers and content creators, content marketers perhaps, where the more old school way of thinking about marketing is high production, very clean, clear-cut messaging. It's very simple.
And 100% control.
And yeah, 100% control. You control the narrative. And there's definitely a world that continues to be high return on that, and definitely a worthy investment. However, given
like the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Super Bowl ad is
Assets.
the classic
Yeah.
thing that still works as the typical TVC environment.
Exactly. And you just look at other properties that are more like visible to the average consumer, like the World Cup, the Euros, which is happening right now. And you ask yourself, why is MasterCard and Visa and these brands still spending so much to put their names behind it? Because it works. They stand for something. So there's a whole idea of like brand marketing. But when it comes to more like the content marketer now, it's so fast and easy to create content. Someone can upload something and receive, create that video in 10 minutes and it receives 1 million views. So it's become a bit commoditized too. So how do like agencies and media companies adapt to that while maintaining their integrity? It's all about curating amazing content and creativity.
And the competition for you or any commercial entity has changed, right? Because you're not just competing with other license holders, but with anybody who will pick up a phone and record and upload a video. How do you make sure that you can compete with those that also don't have anything to lose and can risk everything and going out there bolder than anybody else?
I think about that a lot. The short answer, it goes back to what I said earlier about Vietnam being the only place in using Vietnamese language. So as a result, your pool that you're working with is immediately smaller. Now, Vietnam has, I think, top 5 or 10 viewership in the entire world by minutes consumed on YouTube and Facebook, probably TikTok as well, despite the population size, not being even a top 20, I think. I might be wrong on that. But people in Vietnam are engaging online in a disproportionate way. So my best answer to that is because Vietnam is the only place that speaks Vietnamese, the ability to create high quality curated content and for you to be a thought leader in that category is very high. Let's take something like professional development or careers advice. How many content creators / media companies are actually talking only about that in Vietnam? I actually know because I had our research intern do a report on that. I won't disclose that. That's our IP. But it's actually not that much. And when I say the absolute number, it's also those that have actually commercialized successfully. There's a lot of people just creating random YouTube channels that get millions of views but can't be commercialized because of brand protection, brand safety. The content is it's basically not monetizable. So that then whittles the number even further. Because again, here, content creators like to say, oh, we want to make content that's so valuable, which of course is super important, that we don't need brand sponsors. Like we just rely on Google, YouTube ads. But the thing is, you're relying on another brand anyways. So, but it's even harder to do in Vietnam because the CPMs are so low. You can generate 1 million views on a YouTube video and make, I think, on our last video, we just hit 1 million on it, an episode of one of our podcasts, not even $2,000. That doesn't even cover the production cost of the video. Whereas if you got 1 million views with CPMs from the United States or let's say Japan or Australia, where the CPMs are 10 to 15 times higher, that video would have made $10,000 to $15,000 just on ads, not including the brand sponsorship, which would cover the cost and make a little bit more. So because of that particularity and the audience is not as big in Vietnamese content, it's like a big fish in a little pond. But the way to really maximize that commercial return is to really nail down the brand's integration.
But you could argue that those content producers that do it for passion, they might not bother about the commercialization. So they're the bigger threat than others that need to find a model to compete with you. Or you're not worried because at some point they need to make a living. Let's look at it from a perspective of what works for brands, what doesn't work for brands. You have some of the biggest advertisers in the world working with you, some young brands, some established brands. What do you think are some of the tricks and tips of brands engaging into new formats or new topics? What works, what doesn't work at the end of the day?
So in our world, given the formats that we specialize in, I think the brands that end up succeeding with us are ones that are willing to and want to set the standard, want to innovate and be the leader in a category. And so that mindset will help drive innovation at a content level. But if it's more about, oh, we just want to have our market share, we just want to keep the communication going, it gives very little space to be innovative. I'm not saying it's cheaper or more expensive or higher ROI to do that way, but the ones that have succeeded have been willing to adopt that mindset. So of course, that's easier said than done. I think the champions that we've been able to work with within organizations have been supremely supportive and you can say imperative to the performance of that brand on Viet Cetera. So we proposed to basically take that IP and that audience and put it onto a podcast, and they agreed. But because it was a bit ad hoc budget, it wasn't like line itemed at the beginning of the fiscal year, they couldn't spend more than a certain amount, but it was just enough to get it going. So we took that cash and I think created 20 or so episodes of the first season, and it was a hit. And from there, I'm not on the implementation team, but I can tell you now that the team, and including the brand manager of Durex, won a lot of praise at the company about not investing a massive amount of money. It's still a decent amount, but willing to set the bar, especially in a space like sexual health, condoms at the end of the day, which are a bit taboo. Everyone probably has a demand for it, but it's not obviously something spoken about a lot. So instead of just doing another article or a banner ad advertising, which totally fine as well, they wanted to go content and on a format that was innovative. And 4 or 5 years later, it's continued and evolved, in fact. And that IP has grown from a podcast to now an event. So that was a case of a very successful collaboration on both sides, where they feel like they co-own a property, although they don't technically own it. We have an asset that's growing and the IP value increases over time, and they seem really proud of it too. So that's a very successful one. On the more angle of not so successful, the ones that I found is, unfortunately, they have the budgets. It's not about the budgets. It's not about assigning, responsibility or blame or something like that. But I find that some of the not successful ones don't understand the difference between content and marketing / advertising. They're very different things at the end of the day, and totally understand. It's like if I were a brand manager going to procurement, the CFO, and let's say you're choosing between two brands, one that's very visible and one that's not. What will you propose? You'll probably propose the big one because it's just less risk to you, less explanation. You don't have to go through 100 questions with the CEO asking, like, what is that compared to, let's say, et cetera. It's obviously a different ballgame now because we're much larger and more visible in the community. But I remember 4 or 5 years ago, it was extremely challenging. And we're very grateful for the people that did go to bat for us.
So in a nutshell, a brand that wants to create, co-own, co-produce a content asset has to be willing to let go to a certain extent and be part of the story and accepting from the beginning that they are not the story themselves. Yeah,
I think you have to be. And that's what will help establish leadership in the category too. So there's an analogy I like to use actually about leadership in a category. One of our close partners is the distributor of a whiskey brand. And when he established the presence of that whiskey brand 15 years ago, it was unknown. With that said, people knew what whiskey was, but it wasn't like mass. So it was a very greenfield market. So he came in, and instead of using the word whiskey, he used the name of the brand. So people started calling it that instead of whiskey. So an example is like, nobody actually says search anymore. People say Google. Or people don't say AI, they say ChatGPT. So the name of the company becomes the action, the verb. And that's so powerful. It's like podcasting. It's like people know it's et cetera. Like we've heard stories actually where some of our fans want to buy the microphone that we have. It's a Shure mic. This is a Rode mic, which is very good. We also have a Shure mic. And people will go to the electronic stores and asking, oh, do you have this camera, this microphone to take a picture? And the shop owner will be, oh, that's the et cetera mic. So like we've started becoming synonymous with like certain nouns. Yeah.
Well, it's the same like in the old days. Let's FedEx that, let's Xerox that.
Yep.
Can I have a Coke? Sorry, we only have Pepsi. Right? That's kind of category ownership as a product, right?
Yep.
Or jeans wear Levi's at some point.
Yep.
Do you have also kind of situations where a brand wants to be too innovative and take too much of a risk where you have to say, as a voice of reason, let's dial it down, or that's not for us?
Yes, I think that's where the role of like the creatives and the account managers comes in. It's like how to rein in things, and that's internally too. Sometimes we oversell our capabilities, and I can speak on behalf of myself when I say that. I think the short answer is yes. And it's maybe not understanding what et cetera can do. Like people say, oh, podcast, I want to do that too. But then when it comes to actual execution, like there's no curation, the product quality of the shot is not so good, the audio is missing, something like that. And they're taking shortcuts to try to achieve the same outcome. And it just doesn't work.
Let's move to another topic, and that's about growing the company. You've been around for about 8 years, you said. How do you deal with the fact that the company, the organization is maturing, and people on the journey with you might have been great for the first X years, but now you realize we need different skills, maybe even a different attitude. We need different knowledge in the business.
It happens a lot. We've had staff that worked for us for 4 or 5 years who left about 2 years ago, as an example. She wanted to come back, but we just couldn't find a place to have her fit. So it didn't work out. this happens even to the founders. So, for instance, we were talking off camera about ourselves as the leaders of our companies. We have to continually evolve and adapt to be the most useful, because at the end of the day, the health of the company is also very different from the health of the individuals. Everyone has to find their place. And even speaking for myself as CEO, I've had to adapt my role a considerable amount, especially just in the past 12 months, due to some internal changes. And yeah, it's been a huge struggle. Like, I am a very detailed person. I used to be. I am not anymore. Maybe it's because of the expanse of what we're covering, headcounts, the revenue. Everything is just a different scope now, and it's hard for me to be detailed. And so I become frustrated with myself because I'm trying to pour over everything, and it's like impossible because you only have 24 hours in a day. Yeah, I've even had to adjust my health habits. Like, I eat very differently now. I sleep very early. There's a joke in town in Saigon where if you see how after 9 p.m., first, it probably would not happen. But second, it's very rare, basically. It's a rare sighting. A lot of my friends are like, oh my God, how have I got out? Like, I just need to sleep earlier now because it changes with age as well. But I just love my mornings. So, I think you have to ask yourself, not of others too, but of course of yourself.
Also, the pressure goes up on yourself more than from others, right? Mm-hmm. And you have to be productive every day delivering.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe to round up today's episode, with all the successes and evolution you've shared, what still keeps you awake at night? Your early night.
Yeah, my early night. A lot of people always ask me, like, so who's your competition? And I'm just like, well, I don't think about that because I think about the internal a lot more. I think what makes or breaks teams and companies and brands is always a battle from within, never from the outside. Yes, you'll always have a pitch where you have competitors. Yes, you'll always have someone producing something that's trying to copy you. Fine, but you'll figure out ways to combat those. But the battles from within, like alignment with teams, recruiting the wrong people, or you hiring the wrong people. It's not even about the person. It's like you just made the incorrect scope of work for that person. It's always from the within. Controlling spending, things like that as an example. So to answer your question succinctly, what keeps me up at night is the battles from within, not from the outside.
It was a negative point of view. What gets you to bed with a big smile?
Okay, yeah. Good point. Better way to ask that is what wakes me up in the morning, right? Because I do wake up very early. I think you have to have that excitement. You have to have the go-get attitude. I love waking in the morning and making it happen, making magic happen, whatever it might be. Before I go to sleep every night, I look at my calendar to see what's going on, and I just get excited. So maybe that's just me, but if you're not excited, and there's days I have that as well. Don't get me wrong. You have to ask yourself why. And so I've started auditing my time, what really allows me to enable my own success, and unlock other people's success. Okay, do more of that, and the stuff that just makes me fear and just not happy, just get rid of those. And that goes for not just work but also in personal life. And you just have to ask those questions and just hack at it. And I do that every day. So
okay, thank you very much. I think that concludes today's episode of Leadership Talks with Hao from the Etc. We talked about how to connect with customers, and I thought we learned so much from media consumption habits to what brands want to do to how to look at it from an inside view. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Lars. Yeah, and see you guys next time. Thank you so much, Advertising Vietnam and Precious, for having me. Take care.